The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty training ground at the joint military base in Afghanistan. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her rifle scope, feeling the familiar weight of her weapon against her shoulder. She had been with the Navy SEALs for 3 years now, one of only a handful of women to earn her place among the elite unit. Her teammates respected her skills, but she still felt the need to prove herself every single day. The British SAS unit had arrived 2 days earlier for joint training exercises. Sarah watched them from across the compound, noting their confident swagger and the way they seemed to own every space they entered. She had worked with international forces before, but there was something about this particular group that rubbed her the wrong way. Maybe it was the way they looked at her, or the comments she overheard when they thought she wasn't listening. Bloody hell, they're letting birds handle the big guns now, are they? One of them had muttered yesterday, thinking he was out of earshot. Sarah had said nothing, but her jaw had tightened. She was used to this kind of talk, but it never got easier to hear. Lieutenant Commander Harris called the teams together for the morning briefing. The exercise would be a simulated urban warfare scenario, with both units working together to clear a mock village that had been constructed for training purposes. Sarah studied the maps and listened carefully to the objectives. Her role would be overwatch, providing sniper support from an elevated position while the assault teams moved through the buildings below. As the briefing ended, Sarah began checking her equipment methodically. Her rifle was a customized M24 sniper weapon system, modified to her exact specifications. She had earned her nickname Ghost for her ability to remain unseen and her uncanny accuracy at extreme distances. Her longest confirmed kill was at 1,847 meters, a record that even impressed her hardest critics back home. The British sniper approached her station with a cocky grin. He was tall and lean with sharp features and cold blue eyes. His name tag read Thompson, and Sarah had already heard stories about his reputation. He was considered one of the best marksmen in the SAS, with numerous successful operations under his belt. "So, you're the famous American sniper everyone's been talking about," Thompson said, his accent thick and condescending. "Heard you've got quite the reputation back in your unit." He looked her up and down, clearly unimpressed by what he saw. "Must be nice having special treatment, eh? Different standards for the ladies and all that." Sarah continued her equipment check without looking up. "Standards are the same for everyone who makes it this far," she replied calmly. "Maybe even higher." She had learned long ago not to let these comments get under her skin, at least not visibly. Inside, her competitive fire was already burning. Thompson laughed, a harsh sound that carried across the preparation area. "Right then, love. We'll see about that when the real shooting starts." He gestured toward the practice range visible in the distance. "Care to give it a go? Little friendly competition before the main event? Unless you're worried about embarrassing yourself in front of the lads." Several other soldiers had gathered around, sensing the tension in the air. Sarah's teammates exchanged glances, knowing their sniper well enough to recognize the dangerous calm that had settled over her features. They had seen this look before, and it usually meant someone was about to learn a very expensive lesson. "What did you have in mind?" Sarah asked, finally looking up from her rifle. Her voice was steady, but there was steel underneath that Thompson was too arrogant to recognize. "Simple shooting competition," Thompson said, warming to his theme. 5 targets at increasing distances. Best score wins. Loser buys drinks for both teams tonight." He paused, his grin becoming even more unpleasant. "Course, if you're not up for it, no shame in backing down. Wouldn't want you to feel bad when you lose." The circle of watching soldiers had grown larger now, with members of both units gathering to witness what was clearly becoming more than just casual banter. Sarah could feel all eyes on her, waiting to see how she would respond. Some faces showed curiosity, others skepticism, and a few displayed the kind of predatory interest that came with watching a potential conflict unfold. 5 targets sounds fair," Sarah said quietly. "But let's make it interesting. 10 targets, distances from 300 to 1,200 meters. Each shooter gets 1 shot per target. No spotters, no wind calls, just pure skill." She stood up slowly, her full height still several inches shorter than Thompson, but her presence somehow filled the space around her. Thompson's confident expression flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself. "Ambitious little thing, aren't you? Fine by me. Though I should warn you, I don't believe in going easy on anyone, regardless of gender." The way he said the last word made it clear he considered it a weakness rather than simply a fact. "I wouldn't want you to," Sarah replied. "Wouldn't be much of a competition otherwise." She slung her rifle across her shoulder and started walking toward the range. "Coming? Or do you need time to think about it?" The crowd began following them across the compound, word spreading quickly about the impromptu shooting match. By the time they reached the range, nearly 50 soldiers had gathered to watch. The rangemaster, a grizzled sergeant with 20 years of experience, raised his eyebrows when he heard what they wanted to do. 10 targets out to 1,200 meters? In this wind? He glanced at the flags fluttering in the variable breeze. "That's ambitious even for you two. You sure about this?" Thompson stepped forward, his chest puffed out with confidence. "Wouldn't have suggested it if I wasn't sure, Sergeant. Though perhaps the lady would prefer to start with something more manageable?" He looked at Sarah with mock concern. "No shame in working your way up to the longer shots." Sarah simply nodded to the rangemaster. "Set them up, Sergeant. All 10 targets." She began preparing her rifle, checking the scope settings and testing the wind with a handful of grass. Her movements were economical and precise, the result of thousands of hours of training and real-world experience. As the targets were positioned at various distances across the range, both snipers began their final preparations. Thompson made a show of his routine, talking loudly about wind conditions and bullet drop calculations. Sarah worked in silence, her focus already shifting to the zone where everything else faded away except the target, the rifle, and the shot. The range fell silent as both shooters took their positions. Thompson chose the left shooting station, making a show of adjusting his bipod and checking his scope one final time. His rifle was a British L96A1, a weapon he had used successfully in 3 different theaters of operation. He settled behind it with practiced ease, his body language radiating confidence. Sarah took the right position without fanfare. Her movements were economical and precise as she deployed her bipod and settled into her shooting stance. The crowd pressed closer, forming a semicircle behind the firing line. Even the rangemaster seemed caught up in the tension, checking his spotting scope and preparing to call hits and misses. "Ladies first," Thompson called out mockingly, gesturing toward the first target at 300 meters. "Unless you'd prefer I show you how it's done?" Sarah ignored the comment, focusing instead on her breathing and sight picture. The 300-meter target looked almost insultingly close through her scope. She had been making shots at this distance since basic training, and it felt like stepping back to elementary school after years of college-level work. Still, she knew that overconfidence had ruined more shooters than wind or bad equipment ever had. She settled her crosshairs on the center of the target, feeling the familiar calm that came with entering her shooting zone. The world around her faded away until there was nothing but the target, her breathing and the gentle pressure of her finger on the trigger. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the range. "Center hit," the rangemaster called out immediately. "Dead center of the X-ring." Thompson nodded approvingly as if he had expected nothing less. "Not bad for a warm-up shot," he said, settling behind his own rifle. His shot came seconds later, also finding the center of the target. Right then, that's how it's done. The second target stood at 400 meters, still well within the comfort zone for both shooters. Sarah's shot was again perfect, punching through the center of the target with mechanical precision. Thompson matched her performance, his bullet landing just millimeters from the center line. "Getting interesting now," someone in the crowd muttered. Others began placing quiet bets on the outcome. Though most of the British soldiers backed their man while the Americans supported Sarah, more out of loyalty than confidence. The third target at 500 meters began to separate the casual shooters from the professionals. The wind was picking up slightly, and the morning heat was beginning to create mirage effects that could throw off less experienced marksmen. Sarah made a minute adjustment to her scope and fired. Another perfect hit. Thompson took longer with his shot, carefully reading the wind conditions before squeezing the trigger. His bullet struck just outside the center ring. Still a killing shot on a human target, but not quite the perfection Sarah had demonstrated. "Lucky shot," Thompson muttered, though there was less conviction in his voice now. The watching crowd had grown quieter, sensing that something special was unfolding. The fourth target at 600 meters stood in a position where the wind was swirling unpredictably around a small hill. Sarah studied the grass and flags for nearly a minute before firing. Her bullet found its mark dead center once again. The crowd stirred, and she could hear surprised murmurs from the British contingent. Thompson's shot at the same target hit low and left, still within the scoring rings, but clearly not the result he had hoped for. His confident demeanor was beginning to crack slightly, though he maintained his outward composure. "Halfway there," he announced to the crowd. "Things get interesting once we start reaching out to the real distances." He glanced at Sarah with what might have been the first hint of respect, though it was well disguised under his continued arrogance. The fifth target at 700 meters was positioned near the edge of a small valley, where wind conditions were notoriously difficult to read. Sarah spent considerable time studying the environmental conditions, watching grass movement and testing the breeze with another handful of dirt and grass fragments. When she finally fired, the bullet's impact was slightly off-center but still well within the vital zone. Thompson seized on this as proof that his opponent was finally beginning to struggle. "Bit of pressure getting to you, is it?" he taunted, settling behind his rifle with renewed confidence. His shot was better than his previous effort, landing closer to center than Sarah's bullet. Finally getting warmed up, Thompson announced to the crowd, his swagger returning. "The real shooting starts now, mates. This is where experience begins to matter." The sixth target at 800 meters was where many recreational shooters began to struggle significantly. The bullet's flight time was long enough for wind conditions to change multiple times during its journey, and small errors in reading environmental conditions would be magnified into significant misses. Sarah approached this shot with the same methodical preparation she had shown throughout the competition. She tested the wind conditions from multiple positions around her shooting station, looking for any advantage she could find. When she finally settled behind her rifle, she held her position for nearly 2 minutes, waiting for the right moment when all conditions aligned. Her shot was perfect once again, striking the exact center of the target with an audible impact that carried clearly across the range. The crowd erupted in surprised exclamations, and several of the American soldiers began grinning openly. Thompson's confidence visibly shook as he prepared for his own shot. He spent even longer than Sarah had done reading conditions, clearly aware that he was falling behind in a competition he had initiated with complete confidence in his victory. When he finally fired, his bullet struck the target but well outside the center ring. "Bloody wind shifted just as I fired," he complained, though his excuse sounded weak even to his own ears. The watching soldiers had grown quieter, sensing the shift in momentum that was occurring at the firing line. The seventh target at 900 meters stood on a slight rise that created its own microclimate of swirling air currents. Sarah studied the target through her scope for several minutes, noting the way heat waves were affecting the image and calculating the adjustments needed for both wind and the increased distance. Her shot was slightly high, but still within the scoring zone. A respectable performance given the challenging conditions. Thompson's attempt was wide of the target entirely, his bullet impacting the hillside several feet to the left of the intended point of impact. "Equipment malfunction," Thompson announced loudly, though he made no move to examine his rifle or request a replacement. The excuse fell flat with the watching crowd, many of whom were experienced enough shooters themselves to recognize the signs of a competitor who was beginning to feel the pressure. The eighth target at 1,000 meters represented a significant challenge even for experienced military snipers. At this distance, factors like the rotation of the Earth began to affect bullet trajectory in measurable ways. Sarah had made successful shots at this distance in combat situations, but never under the scrutiny of so many watching eyes. She settled into position with the same calm professionalism she had displayed throughout the competition, though those who knew her best could see the increased focus in her posture and movements. Her shot was carefully planned and precisely executed, resulting in another center hit that drew gasps of amazement from the crowd. Thompson was clearly rattled now. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. His shot missed the target entirely, impacting somewhere in the hillside behind the intended target. The British soldiers began shifting uncomfortably, their champion clearly struggling in a competition he had started with such arrogance. The tension around the firing line was thick enough to cut with a knife as they approached the final 2 targets. Thompson's earlier bravado had completely disappeared, replaced by a grim determination tinged with growing panic. He had initiated this competition expecting an easy victory and public humiliation of the American woman who had dared to operate in what he considered his domain. The 9th target at 1,100 meters was positioned on the far ridge, barely visible even through high-powered scopes. At this distance, the bullet would be in flight for over 2 seconds, traveling through multiple layers of air with different temperatures, humidity levels, and wind conditions. Even the most experienced snipers considered shots at this range to be as much art as science. Sarah spent nearly 5 minutes preparing for this shot, using every technique she had learned in her years of training and combat experience. She studied the grass movement at multiple points between her position and the target, looking for patterns in the wind that might help her predict conditions when her bullet arrived. She checked and rechecked her scope settings, making minute adjustments based on the changing light conditions as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. The watching crowd had grown to include officers from both units, drawn by reports of the extraordinary shooting exhibition taking place at the range. Even the base commander had appeared, standing quietly at the back of the group with his arms crossed, watching the proceedings with keen interest. When Sarah finally settled behind her rifle for the 9th shot, the entire range fell silent. Even the constant background noise of military base operations seemed to fade away. She controlled her breathing, letting her heart rate settle to its normal resting rhythm. Through her scope, the target appeared to shimmer and dance in the heat waves rising from the valley floor. She held her firing position for what felt like minutes but was actually only seconds, waiting for that perfect moment when all the variables aligned. When she finally squeezed the trigger, the rifle's recoil felt almost gentle, absorbed smoothly by her stable shooting position. The bullet's flight seemed to take forever, though it was actually less than 3 seconds from muzzle to target. Every eye on the range was fixed on the distant target, waiting for the impact. When it came, the sharp crack of bullet meeting target was barely audible at their distance, but the range master's spotting scope confirmed what many suspected. "Dead center hit," he announced, his voice carrying clearly in the silence. "Perfect shot." The crowd erupted in amazement. Even some of the British soldiers began applauding, their professional respect overcoming their national loyalty. Sarah had just demonstrated a level of marksmanship that most of them had only heard about in stories from the most legendary snipers. Thompson looked physically ill as he approached his shooting position. The confident swagger that had characterized his earlier demeanor was completely gone, replaced by the desperate movements of a man who knew he was facing humiliation. He spent an excessive amount of time adjusting his equipment and reading wind conditions, clearly stalling for time as he tried to find some way to salvage his reputation. When he finally fired, even his staunchest supporters could see that his heart wasn't really in it. The shot went wide, missing the target by a significant margin. The British contingent fell silent, while the American soldiers tried to contain their obvious satisfaction at their teammates' dominant performance. "Equipment problems," Thompson muttered again, but this time even his own teammates looked skeptical. It was becoming clear to everyone present that they were witnessing a masterclass in precision, shooting from Sarah, while Thompson's much-vaunted skills were proving to be more reputation than reality under pressure. The final target at 1,200 meters was positioned at the absolute limit of the range, a distance that challenged even the most advanced sniper systems. At this range, factors that could be ignored at shorter distances became critical considerations. The curvature of the Earth began to affect trajectory calculations, and the bullet would lose significant velocity during its extended flight time. Sarah had made successful shots at comparable distances in combat situations, but those had been under very different circumstances with different stakes. This was pure marksmanship, with no room for the kind of improvisation that sometimes worked in the chaos of actual warfare. She would need to rely entirely on her technical skills and experience. She began her preparation ritual once more, but this time with even greater care and attention to detail. Every aspect of her equipment was checked and double-checked. She used a small handheld weather device to measure exact wind speed and direction at her position, then tried to extrapolate what conditions might be like at various points along the bullet's path. The crowd had grown silent again, sensing the significance of this final shot. Even Thompson stood quietly behind his shooting position, apparently resigned to his fate but still watching with professional interest to see if Sarah could complete her remarkable performance. Thompson knew that even if he somehow managed a perfect shot on this final target, he had already lost the competition decisively. His earlier confidence about showing the little American girl how real shooting was done had been thoroughly demolished by her consistent precision and unflappable composure under pressure. Sarah's preparation for the final shot took nearly 10 minutes. She repeatedly checked and adjusted her scope settings, accounting for the increased distance and the changing atmospheric conditions as the morning progressed. The target was barely visible even through her high-powered optics, appearing as little more than a dark spot against the distant hillside. When she finally settled into her shooting position, the range fell completely silent once more. Even the base's background noise seemed to disappear as every person present focused on this final demonstration of skill. Sarah's breathing became deep and controlled, her heart rate slowing to the rhythm she had trained her body to maintain during critical shots. The crosshairs in her scope danced slightly with each heartbeat, but she had learned to time her shots for the natural pause between beats when her body was most stable. She held her position for nearly a minute, waiting for the perfect combination of wind conditions and body stability. When the shot finally came, it felt almost inevitable. The rifle fired with its familiar sharp crack, and the bullet began its long journey across the valley. The flight time at this distance was over 3 seconds, long enough for doubts to creep in and for second-guessing to begin. The impact was barely visible at such a distance, but the rangemaster's spotting scope told the story immediately. His incredulous voice carried across the silent range. Center hit, dead center of the X-ring at 1,200 meters. The crowd exploded into cheers and applause that could probably be heard across half the base. Even many of the British soldiers joined in, their professional appreciation for exceptional marksmanship overcoming any national pride or gender-based prejudices they might have harbored. Sarah stood up slowly from her shooting position, her expression calm and composed despite the magnitude of what she had just accomplished. She had fired 10 shots at 10 targets ranging from 300 to 1,200 meters, and had achieved what amounted to a perfect score under challenging conditions and intense scrutiny. Thompson approached his final shooting position with the resigned air of a man going through the motions. His shot was closer to the target than his previous long-range attempts, but still well outside the scoring rings. When he stood up from his rifle, his face was flushed with embarrassment and barely contained anger. The aftermath of the shooting competition created an awkward tension that rippled through both military units. Thompson stood beside his rifle, his face a mixture of humiliation and barely controlled rage. The confident sniper who had started the morning by questioning Sarah's abilities now found himself thoroughly outclassed in front of his peers and superiors. Lucky shooting, Thompson muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Must have had that rifle specially, tuned for these exact conditions. His voice carried the bitter edge of a man whose professional pride had been thoroughly crushed. Sarah began packing her equipment with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout the competition. She said nothing in response to Thompson's comments, but her teammates could see the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she was growing tired of his poor sportsmanship. The British commanding officer, Major Harrison, stepped forward to congratulate Sarah on her performance. He was a career soldier who had seen enough combat to recognize exceptional skill when he witnessed it, regardless of nationality or gender. Outstanding shooting, Sergeant Mitchell, he said formally. Some of the finest marksmanship I've seen in 20 years of service. Thompson's face darkened further at his commander's praise for the American woman. Sir, with respect, anyone can get lucky with a few shots, he interjected. Real sniping is about more than just hitting targets on a range. It's about operating under pressure in hostile conditions with lives on the line. The comment hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah finally looked up from her equipment. Her expression was calm, but those who knew her recognized the dangerous stillness that had settled over her features. She had tolerated Thompson's condescension and poor sportsmanship throughout the competition, but his implication that her combat experience was somehow lacking had crossed a line. You're absolutely right, Sarah said quietly. Range shooting is nothing like the real thing. She stood up slowly, shouldering her rifle. Combat sniping requires patience, discipline, and the ability to make shots when failure means people die. Thompson seized on her words as validation of his position. Exactly my point. All the range shooting in the world doesn't prepare you for the real thing. Takes years of actual combat experience to develop the kind of skills that matter when it counts. How many confirmed kills do you have, Thompson? Sarah asked, her voice still calm but with an edge that made several nearby soldiers step back slightly. The question clearly caught Thompson off guard. In most military circles, discussing kill counts was considered poor form, the kind of thing that happened in movies rather than among professional soldiers. But Sarah's tone suggested this was more than casual curiosity. "That's not really something we discuss," Thompson replied, trying to regain his composure. "Professional snipers don't keep score like it's some kind of game." 43, Sarah said simply. "That's my confirmed count from 3 deployments. Longest shot was 1,347 meters, made during a Taliban attack on a forward operating base in Helmand province. Wind was gusting to 30 knots and I had to account for a 15-degree slope. The crowd around them had grown silent again, but this time the atmosphere was different. The earlier excitement of the competition had been replaced by something more serious, more professional. Sarah was no longer just demonstrating her marksmanship skills. She was establishing her credibility as a combat veteran. "The shot that earned me my nickname was number 17, she continued, her voice taking on a storytelling quality that suggested she didn't share these details often. "Taliban sniper had been picking off my team for 2 days from a mosque about 2,200 meters out. Command wouldn't let us return fire on the building because of civilian concerns." Thompson had grown quiet, perhaps beginning to realize that he had seriously misjudged the woman standing before him. His earlier confidence was being systematically dismantled, not by boasting or bluster, but by calm professionalism and hard-earned experience. "I spent 8 hours in position, waiting for him to make a mistake," Sarah continued. "When he finally showed himself, I had maybe a 2-second window before he disappeared again. One shot through a window barely bigger than my rifle scope, accounting for wind that kept shifting direction every few minutes." She paused, and several soldiers leaned forward unconsciously, caught up in the story despite themselves. "The local insurgents started calling me Ghost after that, because they never saw the shot coming. My team picked up the name and it stuck." Major Harrison nodded approvingly. He had read Sarah's file before the joint exercises began, and knew that her combat record was exceptional even by SEAL standards. But hearing her describe it in her own words gave him a better appreciation for the level of skill and experience she brought to his operation. "That's all very interesting," Thompson said, though his voice had lost most of its earlier conviction. "But combat isn't just about individual heroics. It's about working as part of a team, following orders, maintaining discipline under pressure." "You're absolutely right again," Sarah agreed, "which is why I'm curious about your own combat experience. How many deployments have you completed with the SAS?" The question hit Thompson like a physical blow. His face flushed red, and several of his teammates suddenly found other things to look at. The truth was becoming clear to everyone present. Thompson was a talented range shooter and trainer, but his actual combat experience was limited at best. "I've been focused on training and development," Thompson stammered, "preparing the next generation of snipers for deployment. Someone has to maintain standards back home while others are in the field." Sarah nodded understandingly, but her expression suggested she had heard similar explanations before. "Training is important work," she said diplomatically. "Takes real skill to prepare others for what they'll face downrange." The conversation was interrupted by Lieutenant Commander Harris, Sarah's commanding officer, who had been watching the entire exchange with growing amusement. "Sergeant Mitchell," he called out, "we need to get ready for the main exercise. The simulation starts in 30 minutes. Sarah nodded and began gathering the rest of her equipment. The crowd began to disperse, soldiers returning to their units to prepare for the day's training scenario. But the impact of what they had witnessed would linger, reshaping perceptions and challenging assumptions that many had held without question. Thompson stood alone beside his rifle for several minutes after the others had left, staring at the distant targets that had exposed his limitations so thoroughly. His reputation as the unit's premier sniper had been built on range performances and training scores, but Sarah had demonstrated the difference between technical proficiency and combat-proven expertise. As Sarah walked away, several members of both units approached her with questions about her techniques and experiences. The earlier skepticism had been replaced by genuine professional interest, and even some of the British soldiers, who had initially supported Thompson, were now eager to learn from someone who had clearly mastered the art of precision shooting under the most challenging conditions imaginable. The morning's events had changed the dynamic between the two units significantly. What had started as a simple joint training exercise had become a masterclass in both marksmanship and military professionalism. Sarah had not only proven her technical skills, but had done so with a grace and composure that earned respect even from those who had initially doubted her capabilities. The real test, however, would come during the actual training exercise. Range shooting, no matter how impressive, was still just preparation for the complexities and uncertainties of tactical operations. Sarah knew that Thompson and others would be watching carefully to see if her performance under controlled conditions would translate to success in the more chaotic environment of simulated combat operations. The simulated village sprawled across several acres of carefully constructed buildings and obstacles, designed to replicate the urban environments where modern military operations most often took place. Sarah studied the terrain through her binoculars from her assigned overwatch position on a hill overlooking the entire training area. The mock structures included everything from single-story residential buildings to multi-level commercial complexes, connected by narrow alleys and open courtyards that would challenge even experienced assault teams. Her radio crackled to life as the exercise controllers ran through final communications checks. "Ghost, this is actual," came the voice of Lieutenant Commander Harris. "Radio check, how copy?" "Ghost copies 5x5 actual," Sarah responded, her voice professional and calm. "I have eyes on the entire AO and am ready to provide overwatch." The exercise scenario was complex, involving multiple objectives and a time constraint that would force both units to work together efficiently. Intelligence reports suggested that high-value targets were located in 3 different buildings throughout the village, and the combined teams would need to clear each location while avoiding civilian casualties and simulated IEDs. Sarah's position gave her commanding views of all 3 target buildings, but the angles and distances varied significantly. The nearest target was only 400 meters away, while the farthest stretched her capability to nearly 1,000 meters. She had already ranged each building and calculated the environmental factors that would affect her shots if they became necessary. Thompson had been assigned to a different overwatch position on the opposite side of the village, supposedly to provide complementary coverage of the operational area. But Sarah suspected the placement was also designed to keep them separated after the morning's confrontation. Through her scope, she could see him setting up his position with jerky, aggressive movements that suggested he was still angry about his earlier humiliation. The assault teams began their approach from the southern edge of the village, moving in coordinated bounds that demonstrated the high level of training both units possessed. Sarah tracked their movement through her scope, noting how the British and American soldiers were beginning to work together despite the earlier tensions. "Ghost, Bravo team," came a radio call from one of the assault elements. "We're approaching Building 1. I need you to check the upper windows for possible threats." Sarah smoothly transitioned her scope to the designated building, scanning each window methodically. The training facility used actor civilians and mock enemies to create realistic scenarios, and distinguishing between them often required split-second decisions based on incomplete information. "Bravo, Ghost," Sarah transmitted. "I have 2 possible threats in upper windows, east side of Building 1. Adult males with what appear to be weapons but civilian clothing. Cannot confirm hostile intent from this angle." The assault team adjusted their approach based on her intelligence, using alternate routes that kept them out of the line of sight from those windows. Sarah maintained her surveillance, ready to engage if the simulated enemies showed clear hostile intent. The first building was cleared efficiently, with the assault teams demonstrating textbook urban combat techniques. But as they moved toward Building 2, the exercise controllers began introducing complications designed to test their adaptability and decision-making under pressure. "All stations, this is Control," came an announcement over the radio. "Be advised, civilian casualties have been reported in the area. Exercise weapons are now live with simulation rounds. Treat all contacts as potentially real threats." The change from blank ammunition to simulation rounds that could actually hit targets added a new level of realism and danger to the exercise. While the rounds were non-lethal, they could still cause injury and would definitely let participants know when they had been killed or wounded. Sarah felt the familiar calm settle over her as the stakes increased. This was closer to the environment where she had earned her reputation, where split-second decisions had life-or-death consequences. Through her scope, She could see that Thompson appeared less comfortable with the transition, his movements becoming more hesitant and uncertain. Ghost, Alpha Team, came an urgent radio call. We're taking fire from Building 2, second floor northwest corner. Request immediate suppression. Sarah quickly located the source of enemy fire, a simulated sniper who had appeared in a window and was engaging the assault team with training ammunition. The range was approximately 650 meters, well within her capability, but the angle required her to thread a shot between two buildings with minimal margin for error. Alpha, Ghost, she transmitted while settling behind her rifle. I have eyes on target. Engaging now. The shot was technically challenging but not beyond her skills. She accounted for the slight crosswind and the downward angle, then squeezed the trigger smoothly. The simulation round struck the enemy sniper center mass, and he immediately raised his hands to signal that he had been eliminated from the exercise. Good hit. Ghost, came the confirmation from the exercise controllers. Enemy sniper is down. Alpha Team resumed their advance, but the exercise was just beginning to test their capabilities. As they approached Building 3, multiple threats began appearing simultaneously across the village. Sarah found herself engaging targets in rapid succession, demonstrating the kind of precision shooting under pressure that separated elite snipers from merely good ones. Thompson's radio transmissions became increasingly frequent and uncertain as the exercise progressed. Control, Overwatch 2, he called repeatedly. I need confirmation on target identification. Is that a hostile or civilian in the red building? Sarah noted his hesitation with professional interest but no satisfaction. In real combat situations, indecision could be as deadly as poor marksmanship. She had learned early in her career that sometimes the most difficult shots were the ones you chose not to take. But that decision-making process had to happen quickly and decisively. Ghost, this is Bravo Leader, came another urgent transmission. We have a situation developing in Building 3. Multiple hostiles, possible civilian shields. We need precision fire support, but the shot angles are extremely limited. Sarah studied the situation through her scope, immediately seeing the complexity of the problem. Several simulated enemies had positioned themselves where engaging them would require shots that came dangerously close to mock civilians. The exercise designers had clearly created a scenario that would test both technical skill and tactical judgment. Bravo Leader, Ghost, Sarah responded. I see the situation. Give me 60 seconds to relocate for a better angle. Moving to a new firing position while maintaining Overwatch responsibility was a dangerous proposition, but Sarah had identified a location that would give her clean shots without endangering civilians. She quickly broke down her current position and moved 50 meters to a natural depression that provided the needed sight lines. The movement took 45 seconds, during which time the assault team had to take cover while enemy fire kept them pinned down. As soon as Sarah was in her new position, she began engaging the simulated hostiles with rapid, precise shots that eliminated the threats without coming close to the civilians. Outstanding shooting. Ghost, came the immediate feedback from the exercise controllers. All targets down, no civilian casualties. The successful completion of the third building clearance marked the end of the main exercise. But Sarah's performance had been noticed by observers from both units. She had demonstrated not only exceptional marksmanship but also the kind of tactical thinking and adaptability that characterized truly elite operators. Thompson's performance throughout the exercise had been adequate but unremarkable. He had engaged several targets successfully, but had required multiple confirmations and guidance from the controllers. His earlier boasting about real combat requirements versus range shooting had been exposed as hollow rhetoric by someone who actually possessed both skill sets. As the exercise concluded and participants began gathering for the after-action review, Sarah could see that the dynamic between the two units had shifted significantly. The morning's shooting competition had been impressive, but her performance during tactical operations had proven that her skills translated seamlessly from controlled conditions to complex, dynamic situations. The respect she had earned was evident in the way soldiers from both units approached her for technical discussions and tactical insights. Even some of Thompson's closest supporters were asking questions about her techniques and training methods, recognizing that they had witnessed something special. The after-action review took place in the base's main briefing room, with both units gathered to analyze the day's training exercise. Sarah sat quietly among her teammates, her equipment cleaned and properly stowed, listening as the exercise controllers went through their detailed analysis of each phase of the operation. Major Harrison stood at the front of the room, using a large screen to display overhead imagery of the training village, marked with the movements of each team throughout the exercise. Overall, this was an excellent demonstration of joint operations capability, he began. Both units showed strong tactical proficiency and adaptability under changing conditions. The major clicked to a slide showing sniper engagement statistics from the exercise. Sarah's name appeared at the top of the list with 12 confirmed eliminations, 0 civilian casualties, and an average engagement time of 8.3 seconds from target identification to elimination. Thompson's statistics were significantly lower. 4 confirmed eliminations, 1 civilian casualty, and an average engagement time of 23.7 seconds. The Overwatch performance today demonstrated some exceptional marksmanship, Major Harrison continued, his eyes briefly meeting Sarah's. Particularly noteworthy was the tactical repositioning during the Building 3 engagement, which showed excellent battlefield awareness and risk assessment. Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face flushed with embarrassment as the statistics made clear what everyone in the room already knew. His earlier claims about combat experience and superior skills had been thoroughly disproven by objective performance metrics. Lieutenant Commander Harris stood to address the group next. From the American perspective, today's exercise validated our training methods and operational procedures. But more importantly, it demonstrated how effective international cooperation can be when professional soldiers focus on the mission rather than national pride or personal ego. The pointed comment wasn't lost on anyone in the room, though Harris delivered it with diplomatic tact. Several British soldiers glanced toward Thompson, whose antagonistic behavior had created unnecessary tension between the units. "I'd like to highlight one engagement in particular," Harris continued, bringing up a tactical map on the screen. The Building 3 clearance required split-second decision-making under pressure, with civilian lives potentially at stake. Sergeant Mitchell's tactical repositioning and precision engagement eliminated 4 threats without endangering any non-combatants. The briefing continued with detailed analysis of each phase of the operation, but Sarah found her attention drifting as she noticed Thompson becoming increasingly agitated. His earlier confidence had been completely shattered, and she could see him struggling to maintain his composure as the objective evidence of his poor performance was laid out for everyone to see. When the formal briefing concluded, soldiers from both units began informal discussions about tactics, equipment, and training methods. Sarah was immediately surrounded by colleagues asking about her shooting techniques and combat experiences. The earlier skepticism had been completely replaced by professional curiosity and respect. "How do you maintain that level of precision under pressure?" asked Corporal Williams, one of the younger British snipers. "I've seen good range shooting before, but what you did during the exercise was something different entirely." Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. "Training helps, but the real difference comes from experience. In combat, you learn that hesitation kills people. You have to trust your training and make decisions quickly, even when the information is incomplete." Several other soldiers gathered around to listen, forming an impromptu discussion group about advanced marksmanship techniques. Sarah found herself enjoying the professional exchange, sharing insights from her deployments and learning about different training methods used by the British forces. Thompson watched this gathering from across the room, his isolation becoming more apparent as even his own teammates drifted toward the group surrounding Sarah. His reputation as the unit's premier sniper had been built on range scores and training achievements, but the day's events had exposed the difference between technical proficiency and combat-proven expertise. "Sergeant Mitchell," came a voice behind her. Sarah turned to see Major Harrison approaching with a slight smile on his face. "Might I have a word with you privately?" Sarah followed the major to a quieter corner of the briefing room, curious about what the senior British officer wanted to discuss. His approach had been formal but friendly, suggesting this was more than just a courtesy conversation. "I wanted to personally commend you on today's performance," Harrison began. "In 23 years of military service, I've rarely seen that level of skill demonstrated under pressure. Your shooting was impressive, but your tactical decision-making was even more noteworthy." "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied. The exercise controllers created some challenging scenarios. It was good training for both units. Harrison nodded approvingly at her diplomatic response. Indeed it was. Which brings me to my main point. We have an upcoming operation that could benefit from someone with your particular skill set. Nothing classified that I can discuss here. But if your command structure is amenable, we might have a proposition for extended cooperation. The suggestion caught Sarah off guard. Joint operations between SEAL teams and SAS units were not uncommon, but they usually involved much more advanced planning and formal agreements between commands. For a British major to make such an offer after a single day's training suggested that her performance had made a significant impression. I'd be honored to be considered for any joint operation, sir, Sarah responded carefully, though obviously any such arrangement would need to go through proper channels and approvals. Of course, Harrison agreed. I'll be speaking with your Lieutenant Commander Harris about the possibilities, but I wanted you to know that your professionalism today has opened some doors that might otherwise have remained closed. As Harrison walked away, Sarah reflected on how dramatically the day had evolved. What had started as routine joint training had turned into something much more significant, both professionally and personally. The morning's shooting competition had been satisfying, but the tactical exercise had proven her worth in ways that mattered more to her career progression. Thompson approached her as she was gathering her notes from the briefing. His earlier hostility had been replaced by something that might have been resignation, though traces of anger still showed in his expression. "Congratulations on your performance today," he said stiffly. "It was educational." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of genuine acknowledgement versus mere social obligation. "Thank you. The exercise was challenging for everyone involved." "Yes, well," Thompson continued, clearly struggling with what he wanted to say. "Perhaps my earlier comments were inappropriate. It's clear that you have more extensive field experience than I initially realized." It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was as close to one as Sarah expected to receive. Thompson's pride had taken a severe beating, and she could see that admitting his mistakes publicly didn't come easily to him. "We all have different backgrounds and experiences," Sarah replied diplomatically. "The important thing is that we can work together effectively when it matters." Thompson nodded curtly and walked away, leaving Sarah to consider the complex dynamics that military competition could create between professional soldiers. The day had started with his challenge to her abilities and had ended with her earning respect from his own commanding officer. As the briefing room began to empty, Sarah's teammates approached with grins and congratulations. They had watched her handle both the shooting competition and the tactical exercise with the same calm professionalism that had earned their respect during their deployments together. "Well, Ghost," said Petty Officer Rodriguez, one of her closest friends in the unit, "I think you made quite an impression on our British cousins today. Harrison looked like he wanted to recruit you on the spot." Sarah smiled, feeling the satisfaction that came from a job well done and challenges successfully met. The day had tested not only her marksmanship skills but also her ability to maintain professionalism under pressure and work effectively in a joint environment with potential personality conflicts. 3 weeks later, Sarah found herself in a very different environment, sitting in a secure briefing room at a classified location in northern Afghanistan. The joint operation that Major Harrison had mentioned had materialized faster than anyone expected, driven by time-sensitive intelligence about a high-value target that required the combined capabilities of both SEAL and SAS units. The mission briefing was being conducted by Colonel Matthews, a senior British intelligence officer who specialized in counter-terrorism operations. Large screens around the room displayed satellite imagery, building layouts and biographical information about their target, a Taliban commander who had been coordinating attacks against coalition forces throughout the region. The target compound is located in a valley approximately 40 kilometers northeast of our current position, Colonel Matthews explained, using a laser pointer to highlight features on the aerial photographs. "Intelligence suggests our HVT will be present for a leadership meeting scheduled to take place within the next 72 hours. Sarah studied the imagery carefully, noting the challenging terrain and limited approach routes that would make the operation particularly complex. The compound sat on elevated ground with commanding views of the surrounding area, while the nearest cover for an overwatch position was over 1,200 meters away. The shot distance to the primary target building is 1,147 meters, the colonel continued, with significant elevation changes and unpredictable wind conditions. Weather reports indicate gusting winds up to 25 knots, with possible dust storms that could affect visibility. These were exactly the kind of conditions that separated elite snipers from simply good ones. Sarah had made successful shots at comparable distances during her previous deployments, but never with so much riding on a single engagement. If the operation failed, the intelligence opportunity might not come again for months. Thompson was also present for the briefing, having been selected as the backup sniper for the mission. His inclusion had surprised everyone, given his poor performance during the training exercises, but military operations often required redundancy in critical positions. His expression throughout the briefing suggested he understood both the importance of the mission and his own secondary role in its success. Sergeant Mitchell will be the primary sniper for this operation, Colonel Matthews announced, confirming what everyone already understood. Her combat record and demonstrated capabilities make her the obvious choice for such a technically demanding shot. The mission timeline was aggressive, requiring movement to the target area under cover of darkness, establishment of overwatch positions before dawn, and potential engagement during daylight hours, when visibility would be optimal but concealment would be more challenging. Sarah spent the next several hours studying every aspect of the target area, memorizing landmarks, calculating range cards for multiple shooting positions, and reviewing meteorological data that might affect her shot. The preparation was methodical and thorough, the result of years of experience that had taught her the importance of planning for every possible contingency. The infiltration to the target area went smoothly, with both teams moving through mountainous terrain under a moonless sky. Sarah's sniper team reached their primary overwatch position 3 hours before dawn, giving them time to establish concealed positions and begin detailed observation of the target compound. Through her high-powered scope, Sarah could see guards moving around the compound perimeter and lights in several buildings that suggested occupancy. The intelligence had been accurate so far, but the real test would come when their target actually appeared. "Ghost, this is actual," came Lieutenant Commander Harris's voice through her earpiece. "We're in position for the assault. Confirm your ready status." "Actual, Ghost," Sarah responded quietly. "I have eyes on target building, range confirmed at 1,247 meters. Wind is variable but manageable. Ready to engage on your command." The waiting period that followed was one of the most challenging aspects of sniper operations. Hours could pass with nothing happening, requiring constant vigilance and readiness while fighting boredom and fatigue. Sarah had learned to enter a kind of meditative state during these periods, maintaining awareness while conserving mental energy for the critical moments when action would be required. Thompson's position was approximately 200 meters to her left, providing a different angle on the target area, but at a greater distance that would make precision shooting even more challenging. She could hear his occasional radio checks, noting that his voice carried a tension that suggested he was struggling with the pressure of the real operation. As the sun began to rise over the eastern mountains, activity around the compound increased significantly. Vehicles began arriving, and Sarah could see additional personnel moving between buildings. The intelligence gathering meeting was apparently beginning to take shape. "Ghost, I have movement in the target building," Sarah transmitted. "Multiple individuals, but no positive identification on the HVT yet." Through her scope, she could see figures moving past windows in the main building, but the angles and lighting made positive identification difficult. The rules of engagement were strict. She could not fire without absolute confirmation that their primary target was present and clearly identified. The tension increased dramatically when a convoy of 3 vehicles approached the compound from the north. These were higher quality vehicles than the others they had observed, suggesting the arrival of senior leadership for the planned meeting. "Ghost, this is intelligence," came a new voice on the radio. "Be advised, we have intercepts suggesting the HVT has arrived in the latest convoy. Positive identification is critical before engagement." Sarah adjusted her scope settings slightly and focused on the main entrance to the target building. When their primary target finally appeared, she recognized him immediately from the photographs and briefing materials. He was accompanied by several other individuals, but he was clearly the senior person in the group based on body language and positioning. "Actual, Ghost," Sarah transmitted. "I have positive identification on the HVT. He's in the courtyard area, approximately center of my field of view. Clear shot available, but multiple other individuals in the immediate area. Ghost, actual, came Harris's immediate response. You are cleared to engage. Take the shot when you have optimal conditions. This was the moment that all her training and experience had prepared her for. Sarah settled behind her rifle, controlling her breathing and heart rate while calculating the final adjustments needed for the shot. The wind had been relatively stable for the past 10 minutes, but she knew it could change at any moment. The target moved across her field of view, occasionally blocked by other individuals but generally maintaining a predictable pattern. Sarah waited for the optimal moment when he would be isolated and stationary, giving her the best possible chance for a clean hit. When the moment came, it felt almost inevitable. The HVT stopped in an open area of the courtyard, turning to speak with someone behind him. Sarah's crosshairs settled on center mass, and she squeezed the trigger with the smooth, controlled pressure that had become automatic after years of training. The bullet's flight time at that distance was over 3 seconds, but Sarah maintained her sight picture to observe the impact. The hit was solid and immediate, and she could see through her scope that the target was down and not moving. Actual, Ghost, she transmitted calmly. Target down. Direct hit. HVT is eliminated. The assault phase of the operation proceeded smoothly after that, with the assault teams clearing the compound and securing valuable intelligence materials. The mission was a complete success, accomplished with minimal casualties and maximum intelligence gain. During the extraction, Major Harrison approached Sarah with a smile that suggested both satisfaction and genuine respect. Outstanding shooting, Sergeant. That was exactly the kind of precision work that makes joint operations successful. Thompson remained quiet during most of the post-mission discussions, apparently recognizing that his backup role had been unnecessary, given Sarah's flawless execution of the primary shot. His earlier antagonism had been replaced by what appeared to be grudging professional respect. As they prepared to return to base, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that morning 3 weeks earlier, when Thompson had challenged her to prove her abilities. The journey from skepticism to respect had been marked by consistent professional performance and the kind of results that spoke louder than any words or boasting. The successful mission would, undoubtedly, lead to other joint operation opportunities, building on the foundation of trust and capability that had been established through demonstrated competence rather than reputation or assumptions. Sarah had proven herself not just as an exceptional marksman, but as the kind of professional soldier that elite units relied upon when the stakes were highest.